Speaking of terrorists, I want to talk about the terrorists who committed the attacks in Russia. They testified publicly that Ukraine paid them to complete the attacks. Now, obviously, it's possible that they just said this because they were tortured and they think that's what the Russians will want to hear and they'll stop torturing them. Yeah, that's possible. It's probably probable, actually. But it really doesn't matter because all this does is further validates for the Russians and Putin that Ukraine, along with the U.S., helped facilitate the attacks. It seems that Putin is becoming only more certain that the United States and Ukraine were behind these attacks, and that is not good. It's not good only for trying to put an end to the war in Ukraine, which it seems that the West doesn't want any part in that. They don't want any part in achieving peace in Ukraine. But it also doesn't help in the long run with China and Russia uniting, because now Russia is becoming more and more emboldened to do something eventually against the United States if the United States is helping facilitate terrorists in its own country. Obviously the West will claim that the terrorists only said this because they were tortured, but they were caught fleeing to Ukraine. There are pieces that indicate that the terrorists did have the help of the Ukrainians, because they claim that anonymous people on Telegram paid them to do these attacks. I think it was something like $200,000 each. But the fact that they were fleeing to Ukraine, it doesn't really make sense for them to flee to Ukraine. You would probably see them taking more of a route to go back to Muslim countries if these were ISIS members. Like I said, whether it's true or not, it really doesn't matter, in the sense that it only validates Putin's belief that we were behind it, the Ukrainians were behind this, and we're only meddling ourselves with Ukraine because obviously of our support of Ukraine in the war, but we're not spearheading any peace talks. We're actually shutting down peace talks in Ukraine. So in Putin's eyes, we're continuing to support a fight against his country. So therefore, we're kind of indirectly at war with China. Not kind of, we are. We're using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. Not only that, but now he's getting further validation in his own head that we helped facilitate these attacks, because the Ukrainians, Putin believes the United States really calls the shots in Ukraine. I fully believe that, because everybody thinks that. Everybody thinks that the United States calls the shots in Ukraine, because you have Zelensky coming to our Congress and demanding we give him more money. So what does that tell you? Who pays for the war? We get to dictate what happens in the war. You don't get to decide that the war in Ukraine is over, because when a peace deal comes up, we're going to send Boris Johnson, who is not even a part. He was the prime minister in another country. We're going to send a prime minister of another country to go shut down a war that we're not involved in. So who's calling the shots? It's the United States, and Putin knows this. So we're coupled with Ukraine in anything that happens, especially something as terrible as this. So Putin is further getting validation in his own head that the United States is launching a war against Russia, because not only are we keeping a war going, that's what we're doing. Ukraine would have lost long ago without our funding. So we're keeping that war going, and we're potentially helping facilitate terrorist attacks in Russia. Now, I'm not saying any of this is true. I'm just saying from Putin's own eyes, this is what he's seeing and what he's believing. It's not good going forward, because like I've already talked about before many times on this podcast, with the new world order forming of China and Russia against us, stuff like this just doesn't help our case any further. And I'll talk a little bit more about China in the next topic. But, true or not, when you have these terrorists testifying in court that Ukraine paid them to do those attacks, that's not a good thing for us, because we're continuing to support this war in Ukraine. You have NATO saying that they want this war to continue for 5 more years. Absurd. Our image towards Russia is not getting any better. When you have terrorists saying that, maybe not you directly, but the country that you're using as a proxy against Russia is paying them to conduct terrorist attacks in Russia, that's not a good look. And like I said, they were fleeing back to Ukraine. There's some pieces to this that make it seem believable that Ukraine had, something to do with this. And obviously, Ukraine and NATO, their motive in that situation would be to try to provoke Russia into a wider conflict to start a full-fledged war with NATO. We as in NATO, trying to provoke Putin, get him to break mentally to where he says, screw this, I'm going after NATO and Ukraine. In that scenario, that's what we're trying to do. And it seems sort of makes sense because if NATO loves to say, like, we don't want a direct conflict with Russia, but yet we're not going to let Ukraine stop fighting, who's not even in our organization, but we want them in our organization. So what are they saying? They want Ukraine in NATO so that Ukraine's fight with Russia could become NATO's fight. So all those pieces show that NATO is not for peace in Ukraine. They want the war to keep going. So if they want the war to keep going and they want Ukraine and NATO, they want that fight to be NATO's fight. What do? Well, if we can't get Ukraine and NATO yet, let's launch some terrorist attacks in Russia, try to get Putin to crack and come at us so then we can full-fledged fight with Russia. Putin has held restraint. Whether or not you believe any of this, that's what Putin sees, obviously. Putin believes that we were behind this attack. It's not a good thing because, like I said, that further hurts any chance of peace in Ukraine. I mean, I don't think there was much of a chance anyways because we're shooting down any sort of chance of peace in Ukraine. But when we have stuff like this, the terrorists testifying that Ukraine helped or Ukraine paid them to do the attacks, that hurts it even more. So Putin has also said some cryptic things towards the United States to further confirm that he's becoming more certain that we were behind this attack in the West. So Putin's restraint is waning more and more, and he's becoming more and more certain that the West is helping Ukraine conduct, attacks like what just happened. But his view of the West is just it's getting worse and worse. Whether true or not, you just had the terrorists testify publicly, it's on video, that Ukraine paid for the attacks. It's not a good sign to get peace in Ukraine, but also going forward in the long run with the relations between the United States and Russia. And with China and Russia uniting, it's not good to it's not good to make our enemies more mad at us and to put a further gap between us and our enemies in that scenario. So that's not a good thing. The terrorists are claiming that Ukraine paid for the attacks. There may be some validity to that, but we're going to be meddled in with Ukraine in that scenario, obviously for good reason, because we're continuing to keep that war going and funding Ukraine. Any attack on Ukraine will be an attack on the United States too. And we've done nothing otherwise to make Putin think anything else.